Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Damian Galvan podcast. I'm your host, Damian Galvan, and this week we have a wonderful guest, someone that I've been looking forward to having on the show for quite some time now. He is an analyst, researcher, and political commentator that specializes in the Arab-Israeli conflict. We actually start this episode backwards and end it looking forward. So it's really interesting the way that the conversation kind of progresses. And what Mouin has to say on the matter is extremely well put. He always has this way of dissecting the conflict with enough nuance and information that is well known. And he really combines it all in such a manner that I really haven't seen anyone else do. You might remember him from the Lex Friedman podcast, where he sat down with Professor Finkelstein and Destiny, and there was who was that? Benjamin Morris was the last guest that they had on, and that's where he really caught my eye. And today we're lucky to have him on our own broadcast. So thank you guys for tuning into this episode. I hope you guys enjoy the episode as much as I enjoyed making it, and here it is. Traditionally, conversations around the issue of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict like to start at the beginning, the early 1900s. Here, I want to start actually backwards for you. I want to ask what it would take right now for this conflict to come to an end, and more specifically, for a Palestinian state to come into fruition.
Well, it's a very good question. And the answer is today less clear than it has been in years past. There is an international consensus on the resolution of the question of Palestine. By international consensus, I mean one which is supported by the vast majority of states on the globe, at least at the formal level. And that consensus is for a two-state settlement. And that means that Israel ends its occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip that started in 1967, and that the occupation is replaced by an independent, sovereign Palestinian state throughout these territories. And that would include, for example, the removal of all settlements and settlers, which are illegal under international law. And it would also include, crucially, a just resolution of the Palestinian refugee question in accordance with existing UN resolutions. This consensus has been accepted by the Palestinians basically since the late 1980s, and formally thereafter. It's been accepted by the Arab League in a number of resolutions through what is known as the Arab Peace Initiative. And crucially, it's also been accepted by states that are much more hostile to Israel, like Iran, because they have accepted resolutions to this effect in various summits of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Israeli leaders have, over the years, occasionally made pro forma statements that they accept this resolution, but that is no longer the case. The current Israeli government and the current Israeli parliament have adopted statements and resolutions that explicitly oppose and rule out an Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories, and even more so, the establishment of an independent Palestinian state in those territories. And of course, even discussion of the refugee question is for them simply a non-starter. And the reason that Israel has been able to do so, and we can get into this later, is because they have enjoyed the support, or at least the passive acquiescence, of their closest allies, primarily the United States, but also the United Kingdom and the European Union. So the short answer to your question is an immediate end to Israel's military campaign in the Gaza Strip, which is now being contested before the world's highest court, the International Court of Justice, as a case of genocide. An end to the blockade of the Gaza Strip, which has been ongoing for almost 2 decades. and a two-state settlement, which includes, on the one hand, the establishment of an independent sovereign Palestinian state throughout the occupied territories, and Palestinian recognition of Israel, which is something that already happened in 1993. But I think the last year has sown doubts, not only more doubts about the feasibility and practicality of such a resolution, which have been with us for many years, but increasingly also about the desirability of such a resolution in the following sense that if you look at Israeli conduct, particularly during the past year, it's increasingly seen correctly, in my view, as an irrational, genocidal apartheid regime, which is dedicated to the supremacy and exclusive hegemony of one group at the expense of the other. And what many people are saying is, okay, even if we can achieve a two-state settlement, will that lead to durable peace in the Middle East? Because these kinds of states tend to make a durable peace impossible because they're always preparing for the next war or provoking it or actually fighting it. And then what we really need to achieve meaningful peace in the Middle East is a fundamental transformation of the Israeli state, because without this, things will pretty much remain as they currently are.
Yeah, I want to talk about one of these major obstacles that we've encountered. And as you mentioned, Israel has been seen by many as an irrational actor at this point. And a lot of people, including inside of Israel, are pointing their finger towards Benjamin Netanyahu. Would you be able to talk about how exactly we ended up with Benjamin Netanyahu? Your friend Norman Finkelstein, Professor Norman Finkelstein, mentioned that Benjamin Netanyahu has been unpopular at times before, but somehow, some way, the Israeli people always end up with Benjamin Netanyahu as their leader. Why exactly is this the case, and how did we get here?
Well, I think it was last year, or perhaps the year before, that Benjamin Netanyahu became Israel's longest-serving prime minister in the 75 or so years of that state's existence. Now, in a system where prime ministers are indirectly elected, meaning the electorate votes for members of parliament, and the prime minister is chosen on the basis of securing a parliamentary majority. In such a system, you don't become Israel's longest serving prime minister by being its most unpopular political leader. The reason you become Israel's longest serving prime minister is because the electorate repeatedly votes for you, or rather repeatedly votes for a parliamentary majority that places you at its helm. And I think when we look at Netanyahu, he has, in each of his iterations, led the most right-wing government in Israeli history. And if you look at the current government, it's really a right-wing government on steroids. I mean, senior cabinet ministers, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of National Security, and several others, are the Israeli equivalent, really, of the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, imagine David Duke being the Secretary of the Treasury or in charge of the Pentagon. That's actually what's going on in Israel now. And Netanyahu has, after each of the elections he's contested, managed to cobble together a coalition of his Likud party, which is the, let's say, the traditional right-wing, largest right-wing political party in Israel, and one that has been moving increasingly to the right over the years, in coalition with a group of what are known as Haredi parties, representing the ultra-Orthodox segment of the Jewish Israeli public. And people, often when they hear ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in Israel. They think that these are the most extreme elements of the Israeli electorate. Well, actually, they're not. They have been becoming increasingly politicized and moving to the right. But traditionally, they have formed coalitions with both the center right and the center left because they have a very narrow agenda of seeking maintenance of the privileges of their voters in terms of state subsidies and so on, and expanding those privileges. And to that effect, they were, for example, in coalition with the government of Yitzhak Rabin in 1993, when he 1992, 1993, when he negotiated the Oslo agreements with Israel, and now some of these same parties are in coalition with Netanyahu in, again, what is effectively a KKK government in Israel. And the other parties that Netanyahu has been allying with in his various coalitions are those that are seen as being even to the right of even the Likud. And I mentioned some of these. And, it's convenient for Netanyahu because when you look at those who have tried to sponsor Israeli-Palestine or Israeli-Arab diplomacy, they look at Israel as a democracy. They're very familiar with its coalition politics and are very indulgent of Israel's coalition politics. And what you often see is them seeking to adopt Israeli positions, even positions they may not necessarily agree with, by saying, well, Netanyahu's hands are tied by his coalition partners. And Netanyahu has been very adept at using these kinds of arguments, insincerely stating, well, I may want to accept this, but I can't because my government will collapse, and so on. But Netanyahu is also known, to put it politely, as a congenital liar, as really one of the most devious and dishonest politicians of the 21st century. And what you notice is that he has lost over the years many of his key coalition partners because he will promise them whatever needs to be promised at a particular point in time in order to secure his majority, and then renege on his word when the next deal comes along. So he's considered, even by many of his supporters, as a thoroughly untrustworthy politician. But he's also, I think, a very accomplished demagogue and tactician who tends to make mincemeat out of his opponents. And that has allowed him to become Israel's longest serving prime minister. Just one last point, since you mentioned Norman Finkelstein. The other point about Netanyahu, the one made by Finkelstein, is that Netanyahu is in many ways actually an accurate reflection of what Israeli society has become during his years in power. So yes, there have been mass demonstrations against Netanyahu's agenda of transforming Israel into a more autocratic state in which the judiciary, in effect, becomes a branch of the executive, and so on. But I think we need to understand, yes, there is much opposition to Netanyahu, but if there wasn't even more support for his agenda, he would not be Israel's prime minister.
Yeah, understood. And one of those places that support has been coming from, and one of those individuals that I think is realizing that maybe Netanyahu isn't always who he seems, is President Joe Biden. But despite that, we recently saw this weapon sale take place, $20 billion weapon sale to the state of Israel. My question here for you is twofold. First, is this support is there a risk that this support depletes, that the United States at a certain point does start to take back their support of Netanyahu and the state of Israel? And then second is a little bit more of a specific question relating to the International Court of Justice's ruling. Is this weapons sale in violation of any component of that ruling?
Yes. Well, that's a lot of questions, and let me try to take those one by one. First of all, I think I'd start by saying a few words about the U.S.-Israeli relationship. Of course, in 1948, when the Zionist movement proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel, it took the Truman administration, I think, all of 11 minutes to immediately recognize it. And people on this basis have tended to think that the U.S. has been Israel's closest strategic ally ever since. That's not actually the case. Until 1967, Israel's closest strategic partners were actually France, and it was France, not the United States, that allowed Israel to, for example, develop nuclear weapons stockpile in violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and provided it with the most advanced weapons with which it scored its overwhelming victory in the 1967 June War. It was Germany, which provided massive amounts of capital to Israel as part of an agreement that was presented as being compensation for the extermination of millions of European Jews by Germany during the Second World War, and to a lesser extent was the United Kingdom. It's not as if the U.S. and Israel had a hostile relationship, not by any means, but it was really after 1967, and particularly after 1973, that the U.S.-Israeli relationship became a kind of strategic fixture of U.S. Foreign policy. And it had many reasons. And among the most important of them was that the U.S. looked at Israel as a valuable strategic asset in a very volatile region during the Cold War. In other words, it saw Israel as a bulwark against Soviet influence in the Middle East. That all began to change with the end of the Cold War. But the US still continued to view Israel as a valuable strategic asset in a volatile region, this time much more against regional foes like Iran than a global superpower like the former Soviet Union. And then you begin to see added to this, particularly beginning in the late 70s and early 80s, more cultural factors like the rise of militant evangelism and Christian evangelism in the United States, which became a mainstay of U.S. support for Israel at the popular level. I mean, if you look at the United States today, militant Christian evangelicals, what are known as Christian Zionists, are actually a much more dependable base of support for Israel than the American Jewish community, which is increasingly polarized about the question of Israel. And there are also other factors. But to get back to your question, I think, in my view, the most important strategic asset Israel has ever enjoyed has been the solid bipartisan consensus among U.S. political elites in favor of Israel and its policies. And it's because that is beginning to fray that we can begin to see a process that will ultimately lead to a reduction of U.S. support for Israel as Israel becomes an increasingly polarized rather than bipartisan issue in U.S. politics, as popular opposition to U.S. support for Israel's most outrageous policies grows. as you get growing misgivings about Israel among what have been its core popular constituencies in the US. I mentioned the Jewish community, but even among younger evangelical Christians, there are growing doubts about Israel and U.S. support for it. And around all this is also a view that is growing, I believe, in military circles, that rather than being a strategic asset, Israel is in some respects really a strategic burden. I won't just in a very direct way, that rather than Israel projecting power and influence on behalf of the United States in the Middle East, we've had to see the United States repeatedly militarily intervene in the Middle East in order to protect Israel. And that's happening now as we speak in the Red Sea and in the Mediterranean. So that kind of foundation stone of the U.S.-Israeli relationship is really beginning to collapse, in real time. Now, in terms of Biden specifically, I'm fully aware of all the questions that have been raised about whether or not he's still a sentient being and his cognitive difficulties and all the rest of it. And, regardless of the extent to which those characterizations are accurate, I think when it comes to Israel and the Palestinians, he's in full control of his faculties, knows exactly what he's doing, and is implementing a policy he wholeheartedly believes in rather than being manipulated into it by others. This is someone who has been a lifelong devotee of the Israeli state and of its policies. This is someone who proclaims himself repeatedly to be a Zionist, which is a little strange because Zionism is ultimately about a foreign state, about having a Jewish state in Palestine, about devotion to Israel rather than about devotion to the United States. And so it raises, I think, also questions of dual loyalty by the U.S. Head of state. But, this is someone who has been a passionate advocate of Israel and its agenda, who has been a recipient of large-scale support from the Israel lobby and so on. And so I don't really think the argument that Biden is being fooled by Netanyahu, being hoodwinked by him, really holds much water. And if we look, for example, at developments during the past year, there has been one consistent thread through U.S. policy towards the current crisis. And that thread has been Washington's opposition to a regional escalation of the war in the Gaza Strip. In other words, it has sought to keep this conflict contained to Israel's genocidal campaign against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and it has sought to prevent this from becoming a broader regional war. And what we've seen repeatedly is Washington making its views clear on this, expressing its policy preferences, but then doing absolutely nothing in terms of using its awesome leverage to get Israel to conform to those policies. So it's kind of, you take a kid to a candy store, you tell him not to touch anything. He starts grabbing Tootsie Rolls and Twinkies and Mars bars and whatnot. And then, instead of taking them out of his hands and putting them back where they belong, you unwrap them, give them back to the kid, and go to the cash register to pay for them, and give the clerk a tip to tell your kid how cute he is with chocolate smeared all over his face. I mean, that's really the problem, is Washington's unwillingness and inability to use its extraordinary leverage over Israel, its military leverage, its political leverage, its diplomatic leverage, to change Israeli behavior. Last part of your question concerns the International Court of Justice. Many of you will have heard about the ongoing case at the International Court of Justice, brought in December by South Africa, asserting that Israel is violating its obligations under the Genocide Convention of 1948 with respect to its military campaign in the Gaza Strip. And the International Court of Justice has essentially made a preliminary ruling that South Africa presented a plausible case in its accusations of genocide against Israel. And that is now going to a full hearing that is expected to last several years. But there is another and equally important case that has been before the International Court of Justice, and that is that last year, the United Nations General Assembly asked the International Court of Justice to issue what is called an advisory opinion on the status of Israeli rule in the occupied territories, meaning the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. The question essentially was, is Israeli rule in these territories a military occupation? And people often think of military occupation as something that is horrible and therefore illegal. Well, it is horrible, but it is not by definition illegal. A military occupation is not something that is unlawful under international law in and of itself. Of course, you can have many policies that are very grave violations of international law, including war crimes and crimes against humanity in the context of a military occupation. But the international legal consensus is that military occupation in and of itself is not unlawful, provided it meets certain conditions, a key one being that it is of a temporary nature. And the question before the International Court of Justice was, is this still a military occupation, in which case its intrinsic illegality doesn't exist. Its lawfulness cannot by definition be challenged. Or has this become a very different beast? Has it become a process of annexation, which is fundamentally incompatible with international law, illegal, unlawful, and illegitimate by definition? And the court, with an overwhelming majority on July 19th, issued a landmark ruling that I would argue exceeded even Palestinian expectations. It ruled that that Israeli rule in the occupied territories is incontestably an issue of annexation rather than military occupation, and therefore not temporary. And it ruled that this Israeli rule is illegal, illegitimate, unlawful, and must be brought to an end as rapidly as possible. Why is this relevant in response to your question? Because it additionally placed an obligation on all United Nations member states not to provide any military, economic, or other assistance to the state of Israel that can be used by the Israeli state to maintain its illegal rule over these territories. And of course, the United States will say, well, we're sending Israel $20 billion of weaponry so that it can defend itself against Iran or Hezbollah or whoever. But the US is actually under an obligation to ensure that not a single bullet, not a single bomb, not a single tank, or anything else that it supplies Israel is used in any way whatsoever to maintain Israeli rule over the occupied territories. It's what's called the principle of distinction, which was also confirmed in a United Nations Security Council resolution in 2016, which is that in their dealings with the Israeli state, UN member states, including the United States, have to ensure that any dealings they have with Israel do not include any dealings with the occupied territories, or rather with Israeli rule in the occupied territories. And since there is absolutely no indication that the U.S. is making even a cosmetic effort, symbolic effort to observe the process of distinction and to ensure that its weapons are not used in the Gaza Strip. In fact, they're being used to perpetrate genocide in the Gaza Strip as we speak. I would concur with the position that this weapons deal is a gross violation of international law and is in clear contravention of the recent International Court of Justice advisory opinion.
My question then is: Are there any consequences? I know that one of the critiques of the international court system, both with the ICC and the ICJ, has been their inability to actually bring forth any action, especially with the ICC's desire to issue arrest warrants for leaders of both Israel and Hamas. Is there any consequences for United States if they do supply Israel with these weapons?
Well, these two courts that you mentioned, which are quite different in nature, they do have means to enforce the resolution. The International Court of Justice, you can think of it as the world Supreme Court, and its rulings can be enforced through a resolution of the United Nations Security Council. Where you're right is that in this case, that's simply not going to happen, because the United States and potentially also the United Kingdom are going to veto any attempt to hold Israel accountable for its crimes, particularly if accountability also affects, let's say, their own interests in terms of supplying Israel with weapons, generating further income for their arms industries, and so on. In the case of the International Criminal Court, which is not a UN institution, but it is an international institution, unlike the ICJ, the ICC deals with individual criminal responsibility. The ICJ adjudicates disputes between states and issues opinions on matters of international law for the benefit of UN organizations and agencies and organs. And the ICC deals with individual criminal liability. And in that context, it has recently issued, or the prosecutor of the ICC has issued applications for arrest warrants for the Israeli prime minister and defense minister and 3 Hamas leaders. Those are not toothless, in the sense that if these arrest warrants are confirmed and issued, every state party to the ICC has a legal obligation to arrest and extradite an indicted suspect to the court in the Netherlands if the suspect enters their territory. Now, there are, of course, all kinds of reasons why that wouldn't happen, but those are the rules. So these are not, by definition, toothless agencies. But to get back to your question, can this aspect of the recent ICJ ruling prohibiting assistance to Israel's occupation be enforced against the United States? As a practical matter, the answer is no. But in a broader context, I think we have to understand that law, and particularly international law, does not exist in a vacuum independently of the political realm. And when you have these kinds of rulings and arrest warrants and so on, the political and reputational costs for states who continue to brazenly violate their rulings becomes increasingly high and generates growing public opposition to government policies that can ultimately lead to consequences. And I think, for example, the case of South Africa is a very good example where repeated legal rulings against the white minority regime in that country did end up having a practical political impact on the conduct of states and governments that otherwise wanted to continue a open relationship of support with that apartheid regime.
Yeah, and that brings me to a question that's a little bit more specific towards some of my audience members. In political theory, there's different pressure points that can bring an apartheid regime or a regime that isn't complying with international standards to an end. South Africa was a very good case of economic pressure, political pressure, and social pressure coming together to actually bring change to that regime. One of the social pressure points that was famous with the South African case and is becoming notorious or infamous, whatever way you want to look at it, with the Palestinian case are college protests. Mm-hmm. And similar to the ICC and the ICJ, a lot of people ask, what is the purpose or how are these protests useful? So my question here is twofold. One, how are these protests useful towards the Palestinian cause? And then two, do you see the likelihood of these protests continuing now that the academic year is going to begin for so many universities across the country?
Yes. Well, I'll answer your second question first. And people in academia who I've spoken to fully expect these movements to reemerge and perhaps even intensify during the 2024-25 academic year for several reasons. First and foremost, of course, on the ground, nothing has changed. And if anything, Israel's genocidal onslaught on the Gaza Strip has intensified during the summer holidays. Second of all, there remain many unresolved issues from the protests during the previous year. So you've had several cases where university administrations have unleashed effectively violent repression against these student encampments. And I think students still feel, there's an account to settle with the university, and faculty for that matter often share these views as well, that university administrators who acted in this way need to be held account for their actions. And secondly, there are also a number of cases where university administrations sought to diffuse these encampments and protests by making certain commitments to either put certain issues about their relationship with Israel up for discussion, or to implement certain commitments regarding the university's relationship with Israel. So, and that is going to be highly contested, particularly in cases where university administrations made these commitments essentially to kick the can down the road and buy time, hoping the issue would disappear by the beginning of the fall semester, and have not taken any actions to make good on their commitments. So, people who know much more about this issue than I do, and who are closely involved with academia in the United States, fully expect that this issue is going to reemerge during the fall semester, and of course that's a matter of weeks. So we'll have to wait and see whether those assessments are correct or not. Regarding your first question, I think these are of enormous political significance. There's of course a whole debate about the extent to which external pressure on South Africa played a role in bringing down the white minority regime, as opposed to the mass popular uprising within South Africa over many years. But I'm going to put that to the side for a moment. If you look at South Africa, it was effectively a solid wall-to-wall consensus throughout the West, starting more or less in the early 1970s, that apartheid was wrong, evil, and needs to be abolished. Of course, there were politicians and political parties and leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who continued to praise the white minority regime as a democracy and denounce the African National Congress and its leader, Nelson Mandela, as terrorists and Soviet stooges and all the rest of it. But on the whole, there was a solid consensus that this regime was an abomination that needs to be dismantled and replaced by a genuine democracy that represents the entirety of the South African population, and not only the small minority of South African whites. Israel is a very, very different kettle of fish. Zionism has never been seen as an evil abomination in majority sectors of Western public opinion. Israeli apartheid has, if anything, enjoyed a certificate of good conduct in the West. And the volume of misinformation and disinformation and agitprop about the reality of Israel and its treatments of the Palestinians over the decades has just been absolutely overwhelming. So the mere fact that this movement erupted during the past year is really nothing short of a miracle. And I think that, first of all, that needs to be acknowledged. Of course, it didn't come out of nowhere. There had been work and activism by many people. So the mere existence and emergence of this movement is, in my view, nothing short of a miracle. And when you look at it in the context of previous years, and again, I make the comparison with South Africa, and that there was no similar assessment of Israel's apartheid regime. I think the political consequences are huge. I mean, the people involved in these encampments are going to be the workers, the managers, the politicians. They're going to end up throughout U.S. society in the years and decades to come. And many of them will have either participated in these movements, or they have become more sensitized to the issues by having observed these movements and the issues they're raising. Of course, there are also quite a few who will have been opposed to these movements and their agendas, but it's really a sea change, which I think should be added to the cumulative political impact this is going to have over time. Getting back to our earlier discussion about, what are the long-term prospects for continued unconditional and unqualified U.S. support for Israel. And just to make one last comparison with South Africa, the real turning point for South Africa's international reputation was the Sharpeville massacre in 1960. It was some 35 years later, during the mid-1990s, that the white minority regime was finally dismantled and replaced by a democratic state. One hopes, resolution of this issue isn't going to take another 35 years, but it's just a cautionary tale against immediate gratification and expecting that a successful campaign today is going to change the world by the end of next month.
Yeah. My next question brings us to something even more grim, if we can believe that. It's the prospect of World War III that has been brought up by a lot of analysts, more popular online, I believe, than a lot of analysts talking about. One area that I was a little bit curious about and would like to prod you on is the Iran nuclear deal. So right now in the United States, we're in the middle of our primary election season. And one thing that is a focal point is this conflict that's going on in the Middle East, and specifically the prospect of Iran obtaining nuclear weapons. In 2015, the Obama administration got the Iran nuclear deal done. So my question to you is what were the consequences of Trump backing out of this nuclear deal? And what are the prospects that a larger regional, if not larger international conflict, does come into fruition?
Well, I wouldn't exclude anything, but having said that, I think World War III is not really on the cards, at least not in the immediate future. This isn't the Cold War. It's true that the United States has indicated its unconditional and unqualified support for Israel, including what it characterizes as Israel's right of self-defense against Iran's right of self-defense as a result of Israel's assassinations on its territory. It's true that Iran has increasingly strengthened its relationships with Russia and China, but the idea that these are kind of two opposing blocks that are about to go to war against each other, like during the Cold War, is I think, at least at present, a little far-fetched. A much more plausible scenario is that of a regional war. But first, you asked me about the Iranian nuclear agreement, and that, of course, that was negotiated and concluded in 2015. And because the premise was that Iran's prospects of developing a nuclear weapon constituted the main issue to be resolved, it placed all kinds of very detailed restrictions on the Iranian nuclear program. But because it was assumed that the US would respond to Iranian compliance by lifting its sanctions, it placed virtually no obligations on the other parties to the conflict to fulfill their commitments. And so then you had a situation, and it was an international agreement, by the way. It wasn't a bilateral US Iranian agreement, and it was one that was formally endorsed by the UN Security Council, which, if I'm not mistaken, makes that a binding international treaty. Nevertheless, in 2018, President Trump, acting at the recommendation of his short-lived national security advisor, John Bolton, unilaterally renounced U.S. Participation in this agreement and withdrew from it, and replaced those with unprecedentedly severe sanctions. And in addition to that, shortly before leaving office, assassinated the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, General Qasem Soleimani, bringing the US and Iran at the time to the brink of war. I mean, I was recently reading an interview with a senior US military officer. I unfortunately can't recall his name. And he said that it was only as a result of a miracle that the ballistic missiles that Iran fired at the Al-Assad US military base in Iraq in retaliation for the US's assassination of Soleimani. He said it was only a miracle that it only resulted in concussions among a number of US troops rather than the killing of, he said, up to 150 soldiers who were at that base. And he said it was basically pure luck that accounted for this difference. Now imagine if that pure luck didn't exist on that night. That would almost certainly, I think, have led to a US Iranian armed confrontation, which of course is what a number of senior officials in the Trump administration, like Mike Pompeo and others at the time, were angling for. But getting back to your question, so the U.S. withdraws from the nuclear deal, renounces it unilaterally. Iran does not, but first begins exercising some of its rights under that deal to begin ceasing compliance with certain aspects of that deal. And what has happened since 2018 is that, of course, Trump was replaced by Biden. Biden had the choice to immediately and unconditionally recommit the US to that agreement and then demand that Iran resume full and unqualified compliance with that deal. That's not what the Biden administration did. The Biden administration did is it tried to negotiate its way back into the nuclear agreement by seeking to change the character of that agreement, by adding new demands. It's like you conclude a business transaction with someone, then you withdraw from the contract, and then you come back and say, well, you're prepared to respect that contract, provided that you first completely rewrite that contract. Well, that's not how the world works. And of course, the Iranians told the Americans to take a hike because they said, here's the agreement. It's an international agreement. Everyone else is complying with it. You either rejoin or you don't, but we're not going to renegotiate something that everyone has already signed. So that agreement has basically been dying a slow death, as a result of which Iran has become a nuclear threshold state. And that means that it has the technology and the resources and the know-how to develop a nuclear weapon within a fairly short period of time, should the political decision to do so be made. I know nothing about nuclear physics or nuclear weapons program, but that appears to be what people who are familiar with such issues have concluded, while also saying that Iran appears not to have taken that political decision. The issue at present is that may be changing, and that it may be changing as a result of Israel's recent assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in the Iranian capital, Tehran. And you're beginning to hear Iranian voices saying it's time for us to revisit this issue and have a serious discussion about whether we should remain a nuclear threshold state or whether we should become a nuclear weapon state like India, Pakistan, North Korea, who also developed, and Israel, of course, who also developed their weapons in contravention of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and view this as the ultimate guarantor of state security. And that of course, would be a very dangerous development, not because Iran would have nuclear weapons, which of course is in and of itself an unwelcome reality for any state to have nuclear weapons, but because it will be that the only nuclear power in the Middle East, Israel, will have ultimately provoked a nuclear threshold state, Iran, to become a nuclear armed state, and thereby replacing the prospect of a nuclear weapons free zone in the Middle East with a potential nuclear arms race in the region. Pakistan has nuclear weapons as well. How will Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia respond to an Iranian program? So that's extremely dangerous development. But in the shorter term, I think a regional conflict is very plausible, and I think of prospects for it are increasing. And I won't get into all the details now, but the longer the conflict in the Gaza Strip goes on, the more likely we are to see a further expansion of regional conflict. We already have it on the Israeli-Lebanese border. We already have it in Yemen and the Red Sea and so on. And that could very well expand very significantly in the coming days and weeks.
And to pivot back to where we started here with the final question, you've previously mentioned that Israel will either come to a crushing victory or a crushing victory that leaves it in an unprecedentedly strong position in the region, or a strategic defeat that will leave it in a position where its future might very well hang in the balance. In preparation for this interview, I spoke to someone that specializes in Middle Eastern state formation, and they told me that the probability of a Palestinian state might be harmed by either one of those positions, mainly because we see that most progress is made in the issue of Palestine when we encounter what they refer to as a herding stalemate, where both parties are in a position that negotiation seems like the best way to get out of whatever herding stalemate they find themselves in. What's your response? What's your position in regards to that?
Regarding my previous statement, that wasn't a dichotomy that I was advocating. Rather, that was my assessment of where we are at present. And let me just briefly explain the background to that. And it relates to where our discussion of the previous question concluded. So, the crisis did not begin on October 7th. Of last year, but it certainly erupted once again on October 7th of last year with Hamas's unprecedented attacks on and within southern Israel. And Israel's military campaign in the Gaza Strip, which quickly assumed genocidal proportions, began on that same day. That's in the Israeli-Palestinian arena. But what you next had is that on October 8th, the Hezbollah movement in Lebanon began launching its own series of attacks on northern Israel. It wasn't intended as a full-scale war, and it was described as a quote-unquote support front. And the way Hezbollah explained its position, it was doing so in support of the Palestinians, and that its own clashes with Israel on the northern border, or the southern border if you're in Lebanon, were organically related to what was happening in Gaza. In other words, Hezbollah will keep firing as long as Israel is firing at the Gaza Strip. And the moment there's a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, Hezbollah will call a ceasefire in Lebanon as well. Same happened subsequently with these various militias in Iraq and Syria that were shooting drones and missiles at Israel and then at U.S. Military bases in Iraq and Syria and Jordan. The same was the case with the Houthi movement in Yemen, which began attacking shipping in the Arabian Sea and the Red Sea. So until July, you had a situation where the regional conflict was escalating, but it was subject to what most analysts have described as a controlled escalation ladder that did not amount to full-scale war and could be very simply resolved by reaching a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, because all these other belligerents were saying, that ends, we stop. That continues, we continue. The difference now is that Israel's assassination of of most senior military leader of Hezbollah in Beirut, and then of the Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, appears to have changed the equation, because what Hezbollah has said is the support front will continue as it is, will continue until there's a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, and will come to a halt the moment there is a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. But there's also a separate matter, which is Hezbollah intends to retaliate, not symbolically or covertly or indirectly, but directly and painfully at Israel for its assassination of Shukr. Similarly, Iran has said that the assassination of Haniyeh in Tehran, crossed a number of red lines for which Israel needs to be directly punished under Iran's right of self-defense to deter it from conducting similar attacks in the future. And the issue here is that they have said that their settling of accounts with Israel for these assassinations will be conducted separately and independently of developments in the Gaza Strip. And in that context, we're looking at the possibility of a regional conflict. And my comment that you referred to was to say that if Iran and Hezbollah indeed follow through on their statements and attack Israel directly with a much harder blow than they have thus far, then Israel will essentially be left with two choices: not respond to avoid a regional war and appear unprecedentedly weak and deterred, or in order to preserve and expand its position, escalate to an extent that it, together with the United States, achieves a crushing strategic victory. And that between those two options, if the scenario indeed comes to pass, there is essentially no middle ground, because the middle ground of reducing these tensions by achieving a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip appears to not necessarily exist anymore. And just one last comment regarding your previous question. What is also being suggested is that one Iranian response to this should be the development of a nuclear weapon. So you take all these developments together, admittedly speculative, but it puts Israel in a win-lose situation, as opposed to a situation where the U.S. can still pull its chestnuts out of the fire, or it can declare victory and go home.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. It really was a privilege to have you on. Your expertise.
Pleasure being on your program.
Is unchallenged. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Damian Galvan Show, brought to you by the Ox Institute. If you want to stay connected with everything that the Ox Institute is doing, be sure to head over to oxinstitute.org. Thank you.